So, welcome everybody to the third session in the Educational Theory mini-series. This series is basically about giving people an understanding of some of the in-depth parts of some modern educational theories and ideas that are evidence-based and a bit of a change from the classic Bloom's taxonomy, Vygotsky, and constructivism that is sort of dominated teacher training for a long time. So today we're going to go through metacognition. There have been two previous sessions so far. The previous sessions have been on schema theory and then also on cognitive load theory. It is helpful if you've been part of the previous two sessions before this one, but it doesn't matter if you haven't. You will still be able to understand and take away a lot of good principles from this session today. So without too much further ado, we're going to get cracking. Ursula, have you got a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering where I can access those. The first
they
two
will be on YouTube on the TTA's YouTube channel. They are the first two sessions. Don't worry about it for now. Like, you will still understand what's going on in this session without needing to watch those. So don't need to feel like you need to panic and go away and watch those first. But they are all going to be online. I think the first one is definitely online. I think the second one is online, but I'm not sure right now. But it will be online shortly. The session is being recorded, and obviously we will make it available on TTA's YouTube channel after the session. So thank you very much for joining me, everybody. My name is John Nichols. For those of you who don't know me, I'm president of TTA, and I've been delivering the educational theory mini-series because one of the things I actually really like is educational theory. I have been a tutor, and my background is having been a tutor for many years before moving into doing tutor training, teacher training all around the world. And developing this series and these training materials. So the session we have today is on metacognition. And metacognition, can we have a show of hands? Who's actually heard of it? Has anyone heard of it? There's at least one hand saying they've heard of it. Two. A lot of people nowadays have heard of it. That's great. And I suppose actually it's probably you're probably more likely to join a session on metacognition if you've actually heard of what it is. And actually the last session will explain why that's the case, which is in a week or so's time. But metacognition itself is one of these things which is very poorly understood. Lots of teachers and educators don't really understand exactly what they've heard of it. It sounds good. They've heard good things about it. There are good things to hear about it, but then their understanding fades off a little bit. So I don't know who here thinks they're an expert and who here thinks they're a novice. I don't know where you are in your understanding between sort of I've heard of it but nothing else, and you understand it really fully but want to learn more. But we're going to try and go through metacognition today. What is it? Okay, we're going to go through what is it. We're going to go through why it's good. We're going to go through how to develop it, and then practical hints and tips, because what we really want to do is for the end of today you go away with something that, despite this being about educational theory, we don't want to just sit in an ivory tower and then just talk about theory all day and then we go back to a lesson. We have no idea what we're supposed to do differently. We want to make sure that actually we can take something away from these sessions and go into lessons and tutorials and actually change something that we're doing to have a positive impact. And the great thing about the tuition context is you can make small changes in your context to really truly innovate your practice in a way that sometimes is very difficult in a school setting. Ursula, is that another question or just a legacy hand? Not sure. We'll move swiftly onwards then. So 4 key points for today. Hopefully we'll get cracking, we'll get through them all, and you will all come away with a better understanding of what metacognition is, how it's going to benefit your students, and how you can develop it. So first one, what is metacognition? Now, I'm going to be a bit mean. I'm going to ask someone to put themselves on the spot and see if they can give a definition. I've got to say, actually saying what metacognition is one of the hardest things that most teachers and tutors that I've spoken to about this topic. There's one of the hardest things they find. It is quite tricky to understand exactly what we mean by this and what it looks like in practice. And there has been training in the past which I've seen which is a bit, well, let's just say some of it lacks clarity in some ways. Does anyone feel they understand well enough what metacognition is to try and give it a definition? Go on, Amy. Amy first, then Daniela, if you want to give it a try after that.
I don't know very much about it, but I think it's where people can kind of be aware of where they're at with their learning and then analyze it so that they can plan going forward and kind of know what they do know and know what they don't know, and then kind of
that's a really good start, Amy. It's a really good start. You've obviously heard something about this, and that's broadly speaking on the right lines. It's a lot about how people understand their own strengths, weaknesses, knowledge, etc. Daniela, were you going to add something to this?
No, I was just thinking that metacognition is the capacity of our students to make links between their knowledges, prior knowledges, and what they would need to learn in eventually a lesson.
Well, that's definitely a part of, although perhaps if we were to get very technical, it's not enough on its own as a definition. But yeah, it's definitely a part of that, because being aware of what prior knowledge you have that's relevant, and being aware of what prior knowledge is not relevant, and understanding how confident you are in categorizing that information, that definitely is metacognition. And look, it's not as straightforward. It's very difficult to tease apart metacognition from the cognition itself. Cognition is thinking, okay, in case anyone didn't know. Cognition means thinking. So metacognition is really thinking about thinking. So it's very hard to just do metacognition in practice. In fact, actually designing sessions to teach people about metacognition is itself quite a challenge. I know, because I've done it. And it's something which your students are going to find very difficult to understand until you do it in practice, until you actually show them what it means in a subject-specific context. So you can show them what metacognition means in the context of chemistry by going through a problem with them and helping them to understand how to evaluate their own understanding and evaluate their own confidence and knowledge. But it's very difficult to just do a session with students and say, oh, well, I'm going to teach you what metacognition is, because then they're probably going to come away very confused and not really understand how it applies to chemistry, maths, English, whatever else. So let's move swiftly on then. What do we mean by metacognition? We've got pretty good definitions already, but the simplest way I can try and define it for you is the ability to think about or reflect on our own thought processes. Okay, was our thought process good? Was it not good? Did we just get lucky? Right? There's a big difference between answering a question and just being a lucky guess and being completely confident because 100% you know this topic inside and out. Yeah. So for example, if you teach maths and I say, oh, what's 7 plus 5? You probably turn around and go, it's 12. And you're completely confident it's 12. You know it's 12. You know how to add up. No doubt in your mind. You completely understand addition. You understand that 5 plus 7 is the same as 7 plus 5. You understand that 12 minus 7 is also going to be 5. All these things are completely confident for you. If you were to apply metacognition to this context, you know for sure you're right. You know for sure how you're supposed to work out the process. You know that your cognitive process to calculate the answer was correct. And you can do lots and lots of other things with that. You know lots of other surrounding information around that. Very simple example. For some students, especially if we take a young primary school child, we could say what's 7 plus 5, and they could just randomly guess 12. I mean, many of you have probably been in a situation where you ask a student a question and they just randomly keep giving guesses until you say, yes, that's right. Has anyone been in that situation? Surely, yeah. Everyone must have been in this situation if you've been teaching for any length of time. You go, oh, what's 7 plus 5? They go, oh, 11, 9, 15, 21. 12 and think, oh yeah, well done, you've got it right. And then obviously they didn't get it right, they got it wrong lots of times. They might get it right in the end, but it's not because they have any understanding of the process. They just kept saying numbers until they got to the right one. So metacognition is about not us understanding whether the student's got it right or wrong. We know already. Metacognition is about the person answering the question or completing the task, the student in that case. It's about the student understanding, I either know this or I don't, or my method works or my method doesn't work, or my method only works but to a limited extent. It's about the student really understanding why they get something right or wrong, or what they do and they don't know. And the more complex the task, the more nuance there is for them to think about that. Obviously 7 plus 5 is a pretty straightforward task. If you know how to do addition, it's pretty easy. Okay, but you can imagine that more and more complicated tasks, they require more metacognitive analysis to take place. So some examples I've given here. First of all, if we answer a question, do we know it's correct, or do we just, this is a wild stab in the dark, right? That is a simple example of metacognition. How confident are we that the answer we've given is actually the right one, right? Would you bet your life on it? Would you bet £1 million on it? Obviously, you don't have £1 million, then it doesn't make much sense. But would you be really confident that you're going to get this answer right? That's an example of metacognition. Knowing what you don't know, like a known unknown, in the words of some famous American politician, is useful, right? And that's also an example of metacognition. You say, oh, I could do this if only I remembered the, I don't know, piece of information you need. Okay. So if I say, oh, ask me how to go to where's the shop in Chinese, you might know most of the words, but you might miss some piece of grammar or the meaning of one particular word. And you know that's the thing that's stopping you from completing the task. That's an example of metacognition. Yeah. You know what you know, but you also know what gap you have to fill in. Okay. Remember that. That's that example we'll come back to as well. And then another example here is, how could you be sure that the approach you're actually taking, or the structure you're using to answer the question or complete the task, how confident are you that it's the best one? It might still work in the end, but it might just be really, really time consuming. Okay. So there's some algebra questions in maths where you can answer them just by trial and error. Well, let's try it if x equals 1. Let's try it if x equals 2. Let's try it if x equals 3. But if x ends up equaling 225, you're going to be there all day. So obviously it's about understanding, are there other methods that I could use? Which method might be best? Not just which method can give me the right answer. Maybe there's more than one method that gives you the right answer. The same if you're writing an essay. There might be more, there's obviously going to be more than one way to structure an essay. Which paragraph am I going to put first? Which point am I going to put first? Which point am I going to put second? What evidence am I going to use to back up point one? Okay. But it's about being able to critically evaluate. Is the evidence I'm using the best evidence? Is there other evidence that fits better? And evaluating that process yourself to be able to complete the task effectively. And then looking back on what you've decided and going, well, if I've done it, am I sure? So it might seem a little bit philosophical and a little bit sort of airy-fairy and irrelevant. Like, why don't you just get to grip and answer the question? But actually, this is really important. A lot of evidence is suggesting that metacognition is really, really beneficial for learners. And learners and students that have good metacognitive skills do tend to do much, much better. So whilst it might seem a bit complicated, a bit like, well, I know if we're talking about this, let's just teach them maths, let's just teach them English. Okay, I promise you this is worthwhile doing. So it's well worth you being here, and you'll become better tutors as a result. So if I'm promising you there are advantages, we best know what they are. So does anyone know any advantages of metacognition? What do you think is a good thing that's going to happen because you've bothered to try and teach your children, your students, how to be metacognitive, or how to exercise metacognition? Anyone got any idea what's a good thing about this? Amy, first hand again. Go for it.
It can make the students more independent, so they're sort of maybe feeling a bit more in control of their own learning, so that they're not just kind of rote learning or whatever. They're actually understanding the principles better to then take them forward to apply to other things.
That's really, really good. It does make them much more independent. The second point is also true, but I would just tease out a very, very technical distinction between understanding context isn't on its own metacognition, but obviously students that have a good understanding of metacognition are going to realize that understanding the context and their understanding the principles and the rules is going to make more sense than just trying to rote learn everything. But if you really do, there are a couple of instances where someone needs to pass an exam where actually rote learning 2 or 3 things is much, much quicker and easier than trying to learn all of the principles, especially for something very complicated. So that, for example, I know in GCSE chemistry, it's quite common for a couple of key chemical formulae to be taught to students, and just the students are just told them, please remember them. There's a lot of people who teach chemistry GCSE, and they, especially for students that are struggling, and they just say, look, please just remember that carbonate is CO3, and they don't bother explaining all the rules around electrochemistry and how you calculate the formula of a carbonate ion, because you can. they just say, please remember carbonate CO3 2 minus charge. Now, obviously, there's a difference then between some students know the rules around how to calculate those formulae and know how to calculate ionic charges, things like that. That makes a lot of sense to do that, especially if you want to go on and study chemistry at all over again, or you want to understand it and really know how to answer those questions. That it is a technical distinction. We've got, but the main point there on independence, absolutely right, and it does give learners a lot more control over their own learning because they can think about and direct it more. I know there was a very good point in the chat from Lisa about students being able to direct their own revision, which is definitely relevant. We've got a question from Daniela, Helen, and then Ursula, and then we'll move on. What's an advantage, Daniela?
Well, I've got the same idea as Emmy, but I would add an advice that my maths teacher gave to me always: check by yourself. And when you tell to the
Brilliant.
students, check by yourself, don't believe the others, this is metacognition.
Definitely, yes, definitely. Being able to check your own work and being able to, and especially being able to identify when your own work is wrong. Lots of students claim to check, but really they just look at it and go, I think I'm right.
Yeah.
That's not really checking. What you really want to do is you want to get to the stage where a student can actually check and identify when they're actually wrong.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is what is really quite tricky. I mean, everyone says, oh, please check your work. I mean, the number of times I've been there when students are about to go into an exam and the teacher says, at the end of the exam, if you finish early, please check your work. And then you go into the exam hall and you've got 10 minutes towards the end and there's a whole load of students sitting there cross-armed.
Yeah.
They're not checking anything. Okay. Very, very classic example there. Helen, please.
Yes, things I was thinking of are whether students know that they learn better, for example, by using a textbook or by writing notes. So sometimes the process of writing, either by hand or on the computer, helps them. Things like that. A bit to do with the auditory, visual, kinesthetic part of things, how they learn in that sort of way, whether sheer repetition helps them, you know, things like that. I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Metacognition.
So certainly I would say that knowing what techniques have worked would apply, right? Being able to decide that the best way to learn this is just going to be to write some flashcards and then just go through them 100 times, right? Or the best way to learn this is for me to really try and get stuck in and sit down with a tutor and actually learn what the rules are, right? Because I don't understand them properly or I don't know some of the rules. Okay. I'm not a big fan of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning styles because I think they're mostly bogus. Yes, I suppose if a student is thinking, oh, which learning style am I? Which one should I use? That is also metacognition, but it's also possible, just like with normal cognition, it's possible for metacognition to reach a wrong answer. It's possible for people to be fallible, right? We all can be fallible. I certainly can be fallible, and anyone that tells me they've never made a mistake is probably not quite truthful. But yeah, definitely, I think being able to select different methods for learning something. I mean, when I was at university and I needed to learn like very complex biochemistry, I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to get a big pad of lined paper. I'm going to write down the entire Krebs cycle until I can, and then check it against the textbook. Anything I get wrong, I'm going to try and focus on remembering that bit, and then I'm going to do it again and again and again. You know what? Even nowadays, I can probably write most of the Krebs cycle, which is some niche bit of respiration biochemistry that happens in every single cell in your body. Now, I learned it, and I knew I would have a method that would help me to learn it, rather than just rereading the textbook 100 times, which probably wouldn't have worked, because it made me focus on the bits that I didn't understand. But me choosing that method was an example of metacognition, because I actually thought about that. Why am I choosing this method versus doing something else? Ursula as well, please.
Yeah, I would say that metacognition also helps students to ask the right questions. So sometimes I teach primary age students, and it's like, I don't understand. Well, which part don't you understand? And some students are able to say this part, and others, I just don't understand any of it. So you have to work through the maths process until you get to the bit they're stuck on.
That is a really fantastic point, Ursula. That's a really, really good point. And that's actually one of the more advanced bits. Students that are using metacognition are much more specific in the questions they ask. They say, I can't do this because I don't know this. And you're like, well, the way of working out that is whatever, right? Whereas students are just go, I'm stuck. Well, okay, that's indicative of a lower level of metacognition. They're just going, I can't see how to do it immediately, so I'm just going to stop. Really, really, really good point. So it's definitely one of the biggest advantages, because students then they can narrow down what it is they need help with to be much more focused, and it saves you having to just spend a lot of time finding out methods. Patricia, last question here quickly, and then we're going to move on to some of the examples.
Yes, well, it's very similar to what you all said. I would say that the students become more inquisitive, and maybe it also helps him consolidate on his exam techniques.
Yes, definitely. And what I would say there is, when you think about your thought process, you identify bits that don't make sense or where there's gaps. So that's definitely the case. Let's go through some of these now. So some of the advantages that I've put down. First of all, that students are better able to focus on a task because they can actively reflect on what methods they're picking, and their brain focuses on actually completing the task. It's very, very hard for students to complete a task and exercise any level of metacognition, and then also to focus on anything else at all. That's near enough impossible. So if they are exercising any level of metacognition, they're almost always focused on the task at hand as well. They need less assistance and get stuck less often because they can narrow down options and try different things. They don't just go, I'm stuck, there we go, I need help. This is about students being, and they often need to be taught this. They're taught, look, give it a try. What methods do you know? Now, obviously, sometimes students will get completely stuck because they have no idea of the topic that's being taught. They've never learned it before, or the information is way too over their head. They don't have relevant prior knowledge, and they just go, I really don't understand. Just like if I was to try and teach you all in Chinese, I'm guessing a lot of you are going to find it quite tricky. Maybe all of you are going to find it quite tricky, and there's someone's Chinese who is really good. Okay. And then it's just overload. But generally speaking, if students are getting tasks pitched at the right level, they are much more independent if they are exercising metacognition. I think we've also had from someone the ability to focus, revision, and learning. This was what Lisa mentioned. They know where they have a gap. So when you say go off and do some revision, they don't just start from the beginning of the textbook or start from the beginning of their notes or just do the next page or the next page from the page they did last time. They actually go, no, I'm not going to pick arbitrarily which bits I need to do. I'm actually going to think, well, I actually don't understand fractions, so I need to go and check that, and then I'll do some practice on fractions or whatever it might be. And then the last bit about the checking their work and identifying errors and being able to actually find errors. The first time a student finds an error in their own work, it's a cause for great celebration. And when I've done this with students, they've thought I was being completely mad. Like, why are you celebrating the fact I've got something wrong? And they think I'm just a nutcase. They're like, oh, what? Like, I got this question wrong, and now I've found that I've got it wrong. You're sort of cheering and you're saying, well done. And I had to you have to sort of explain to them, actually, I'm cheering because you found it yourself without me having to tell you it's wrong. And that's what's really important. And you almost have to focus on rewarding that behavior like you would reward them in any other context where they do the right thing. You need to try and encourage students to properly check your work. Go back through, check the numbers you've used in the calculation, the functions you used. Are they the right ones? Check what you've put in your essay. Does the evidence actually back up? If you're a different person, could you convince yourself of this? Okay. Is there someone else that could convince you otherwise, that the evidence doesn't really support it? When students can actually go through and identify things they've done wrong themselves, it's a very, very good sign they've started to get the hang of this. Okay. So there's some of the key advantages. How are we going to develop it? Okay. How do we go about developing metacognition if it's all this really good thing that's going to lead to these really independent, motivated students who can find their own errors and almost teach themselves to a great extent? There'll still be a role for you as tutors and teachers, of course, because there's always further things you can stretch them for. But if they can start doing the basics themselves, you're already going to have a huge head start. So, number one, very few students do this automatically. So do not assume that they will. Now, obviously, if you teach students that are a bit older, anyone here teach secondary level or above? Yeah, a couple of people. Okay. When you're teaching students that are a bit older, they may or may not have had any experience being encouraged or taught to do metacognition before, and they may have been encouraged to do this by somebody who had no idea what metacognition even was. They just thought it was a good idea, right? That's also possible, right? They may have never heard of metacognition and still do it, right? People still did metacognition before it was really characterized as a thing, right? So metacognition, you could have students that come and they already do this, and that's great. You can still encourage them to do it more or more consistently, but generally speaking, students need to be taught to do this. And you can have adults that don't do this. They just go, oh, I think it's this, and they don't bother checking it. They don't even think about whether they might be right or might be wrong, or how likely they are to be right or wrong. Okay. Then one of the easiest things to do to try and teach this is modeling it. We need to model what metacognition looks like. You almost need to take a student through the process of how to check their work. Because if you ask a student to check their work, they'll go, okay, they'll read it, right? They'll just read it and say, yeah, I've checked it. They won't do anything, even if it's completely wrong. They'll just read it, okay? And if you talk to students about the process, okay, it's enormously helpful for them, because you need to get right. Let's read the first line. You said this, or you've used this equation. Is it the right equation? What does this equation mean? Are you sure it's the right equation? Are there other equations that are relevant? And you could even ask these things when they are actually right, to force them to think about it. I'm going to give you an example here. How many people have ever been in the situation where a student has got the wrong answer and you said, are you sure? Everyone. We've all done this, right? We want the student to succeed. So we go, oh, 5 plus 7 is 11. Are you sure? And they go, oh, well, do you know what that means to students? That means this is your big hint to me that I'm wrong and I should try again, right? But what I always do is I make a point of, if when they give me the right answer, I say, are you sure? Because then the student, it's very funny now, because then the student automatically thinks they're wrong and they should try again. And I just sit there and I just wait. And they're like, oh, hang on, let me try and work out. But that is basically forcing them to do metacognition, to go back through the answer and check you actually know. Because I want them to say, yes, I am sure. Yeah, Daniela is doing the same thing. I love this. Okay. When you ask students, are they sure? And you do it when they're right and when they're wrong, it's far more useful exercise. If are you sure is just code for you're wrong, try again, it's not helpful. Yeah. So use the phrase, are you sure, even when they're right, because the actual process of them then going and thinking about it as though they are wrong, the student will think they are wrong until they get the hang. This is the thing you do anyway. That process is metacognition. What they do when you say, are you sure, is metacognition. So that's a great way of giving an example for them. Help them to monitor things when they're going through a task. So one of the good things you can do here is, as they're going through a task, don't worry about timing it. Take time out of the equation, especially when you're doing something that's new. Like if you've started a new topic and you're teaching them how to do something new and they're practicing for the first time. Literally talk through with them. What's the method? Why are we picking this method? Go through all of the questions they should ask themselves independently when they're doing it in the future, right? Is this the right equation? What can this equation be used for? What can this equation not be used for? Okay, great. Now we've established this is the right equation. Now this might mean that one question takes half an hour. But you know what? If one question taking half an hour means they're much, much more likely to get that question right every time in future, that is what I think is a half an hour well spent. Does anyone agree with me? Yeah. If you're saying, oh, the first time they're adding fractions, they need to do it in 5 minutes or 1 minute. No, I don't agree. Right? The first time they ever do adding fractions, let them take as long as they like to learn how to do it properly, so that in the future they have good habits, they know how to do it, and they feel confident and they feel comfortable. Yeah. So let them monitor how it's going with them. The first time they ever practice something, take so much time to go through and almost quiz them about every which way and aspect, so that they are forced, almost justify in their own mind and build those connections in their own mind. It also means you're going to find out much, much sooner if they actually don't know how to do the question. Right? Daniela, is that a question or a...
No, I want to just to tell you, to share with you another thing I'm doing at the board. When I'm solving an exercise, I am solving the exercise and then I ask them if they've if I am correct, meaning they have to find
great.
mistakes, and this is a similar way to know where, because I might be wrong either.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes I've even warned them, I'm going to answer this question, but I'm going to deliberately make a mistake somewhere, and you need to find it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the funniest thing is, do that and then don't make any mistake.
Yeah, that's a good point also. I will try it.
Because it's hilarious whether they keep looking for things that are wrong, and then they keep questioning them, and then you go, okay, well, tell me how it's wrong. And they have to go through in their own mind how it's not wrong. And it's a really, really good way of teaching them. Now, bear in mind, it might take half an hour to do that, just one question. But that is really, really a half an hour well spent, because they're constantly trying to pick you up on every single thing you're doing, because they think they're going to find the wrong answer. And even make it more mean. Say you're going to give them £10 if they find the error. They're going to question every single thing you do, right? It's going to be so good. And you know there's no errors. Well, unless you actually do make a mistake, in which case you have to give them £10. But if you deliberately make a mistake, or if you make it by accident, that's different things. But the good thing there is, if you deliberately are not making a mistake, but you tell them, look, I'm going to make a mistake, find it. Okay, you get £10 if you find it. Then they'll be searching. They'll be literally questioning every single thing you do to try and find where your deliberate mistake is. And if it's not there, it's all the better for their learning process. Yeah. Okay. So monitor how the approach is going. Encourage them to do this same process. Encourage them to do this, because that is building their ability to exercise metacognition. And then the other thing is, once they've done work, make them mark it, make them assess it. Give them the criteria and give them guidance from your own experience and knowledge. Okay. And say, right, is this the right answer? Okay. Classic. If I ever teach GCSE science, I'm always telling the students to mark their own work. In fact, when I built an e-learning platform, I deliberately made it so the students have to mark everything before I mark it, right? The self-assessment all the way through. And then people said, oh, we can automatically mark this question or this question. I said, no, I don't want to automatically mark it. I want the student to do the work. That's the point, right? I had someone say, oh, can we integrate AI to mark every question? I said, no, you can't, because I want the students to mark it, right? Don't want them to rely on somebody else. I want the students to mark it. I want them to check against the criteria and say, do I think I've got this mark or not? Obviously, then afterwards, you still need to check it with them and say, you've given yourself a mark, but actually you shouldn't get it. And here's why. Yeah. There's been one occasion actually where I had a student that did these exams, and the teacher's given them marks they shouldn't really have got. The teacher's been a bit too generous for a mock. And I've had to go through them and say, well, I only give you 1 mark out of 3 here, not 2. Why am I only going to give you 1? And they have to go and think about it, and they have to find out the reason. Make the students do this work. It's going to be really useful in the long run. And don't worry about the fact it takes some time. You'll cover less stuff in the lesson, but what you're doing is really, really worth it. Okay. The last thing about developing metacognition here, do not try to do this as a standalone exercise. When researchers first started producing evidence that metacognition and students that were able to exercise metacognition tended to do better, right? Immediately, a whole bunch of like school training providers turned around and went, oh, we're going to run a metacognition course for teachers. And they kind of just said, yeah, go and deliver this metacognition intervention with your students. So you basically take them for 3 lessons. You don't teach them any of the maths, science, English, whatever. You're just going to teach them metacognition, or teach metacognition in form time. And you know what? For students, this is way too hard, right? I can sit here and tell students this all day long, but they don't have any understanding of, well, they don't have no experience of teaching like you would have. So for them, they don't really understand how this applies. It's not very easy for them to transpose this from a completely abstract context. It just sounds like gibberish, and it's very, very ineffective. So don't try and say, oh, we're going to dedicate a whole lesson to being metacognitive, yeah, with no content. Doesn't make much sense. Metacognition is thinking about the thinking that they do when they're learning. So they need to kind of learn something in order to practice that. So embed metacognition into your everyday tuition practice, not just as a tag on somewhere in the middle. Don't just sell like a metacognition course to parents without any other subject content. Just embed it in your lessons is by far more effective. And they did actually do some research on metacognition programs, and which said this. If you go on the Education Endowment Foundation website, the EEF, you can find some of this stuff where they got people to go off and they gave people some money to go off and do metacognition interventions. Then they checked how the students were doing later on. Didn't make much difference. Problem was, shoving metacognition into form time didn't make much sense. Does that make sense to you guys? There's always a risk of this. It becomes more abstract. So I have to try and anchor it as closely as possible to actual teaching and actual practice. So it makes sense. Yeah. Except my examples are all education examples. Your examples of them will all be maths or English or history or science, or whatever else. Okay. Practical ways to develop metacognition. Okay. So some of you have already given me some of these. The first one and the most obvious one is give the students the success criteria, right? There's a really, really good example. There's a really good exercise to do here. Actually, I could have done it, to be honest. We've got enough time. If I got you to all draw a house on a piece of paper, who thinks they can draw a house? It doesn't have to be the best house in the world. I'm not asking for Picasso here, or Picasso did the wacky stuff, didn't he? I'm not asking for like some sort of like Van Gogh piece of art or like the Sistine Chapel being painted. I just want a house, like a sketch of a house. Everyone can do it. Okay, great. So then if I get you all to draw this house and you all draw it and then I mark you, right? If I go, right, you get 6 marks. The first mark is if the house has a door. Okay, everyone's got a door probably if they've drawn a house. The second mark is if the house has exactly 4 windows. Now, at this point, some people are like, yeah, I've got 4 windows, but more or less by chance. And some people are like, oh, I only got 3 windows. I didn't know how to do 4 windows. And then the third mark is there needs to be a fence around the house. And then loads of people are going, hang on a minute, I didn't ever do that. And then the fourth mark is there must be a goat in the front garden. What? No one's drawn that. No, that wasn't part of the criteria, right? And then at this point, people are going, hang on a minute, it's not fair. You never told us this. Well, this is the same thing with students. Tell the students in advance what the success criteria are going to be, right? What do they need to be expected to do? Okay. I used to, when I was a teacher, actually, I made stickers for graphs when I was teaching science. They had to have axes. They had to be at the right labels. They had to have this, this, and this. So there were 10 ticks. So basically, I would just mark their graph by sticking the sticker on and ticking the boxes for the things they had. Worked quite well, actually, until I lost the file, and then I couldn't print off any more stickers. But never mind, that was my own fault. Helen, question. Helen, is that just a hand that's been left up?
Yes, sorry.
No problem, don't worry. Okay, so the first thing, success criteria. And one of the classic things to do here is to get students to mark their work, show them mark schemes. This is what the examiner is going to get when they mark your work. So you see if you think you've got the marks. Put yourself in the examiner's shoes. Some people like to hide mark schemes away from students, like, oh no, they're gonna, I don't know. It's cheating to have marked your own work. Well, it's cheating if you're doing it during the exam. But if they've done the exam, show them what the mark scheme for that exam actually looks like. What do the examiners get? What are the examiners' perspectives going to be? Because it often helps students to realize that what the examiners get is often quite brief. They're looking for 1 or 2 very specific things. And if you don't have them, you don't get the marks. It doesn't matter if you wrote a veritable essay on photosynthesis. If you didn't say need sunlight, you're not going to get a mark, right? You can spend all day long describing how oak trees grow outside and all this shit, but you've got to show them a mark scheme, or you've got to show them at least how is this assessment, how is this going to be assessed? How are you going to be given credit or not? Almost all of us are going to eventually be teaching students that are going to be undertaking some kind of exam or test of some description, somewhere, right? So at some point, we're going to need to teach them as to what the success criteria are. If there aren't defined success criteria, in a couple of cases where you get taught, you have to do extracurricular teaching, then obviously it makes very much good sense to come up with success criteria so that you can assess that the student has done well and share the success criteria in advance. You can literally say to them, I'm going to set you a test and you need to be able to do this, this, and this. And then tell them that so that when they go off and try it, they've got no excuse. Don't leave them guessing. Right. Second point. Really, really interesting one here. Students need to have access to information on how well they're doing. Now, you can have apps. Like I created a learning platform partly because I could then do this with my students. I didn't have a good way of doing it before. Now, I don't recommend you go out and create a learning platform. This is an incredible headache. Honestly, I promise you, it's not a good investment of your time. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of money, and it's a huge, huge amount of mental work and pain. But You need something to be able to give your students information on how they're doing, right? People often write reports to parents. Actually, giving a report to the student is much more useful. Yeah, especially if the student knows the parent will also see it. Now, often if you work for an agency or you committed to parents, you're going to provide reports. You have to do that separately anyway. But give some kind of reporting to the student. Give them some kind of access to how well they're done. Sign them up for some kind of app so they can see where they're doing well and where they're doing badly if you want, right? But the important thing here is that if students are going to exercise metacognition on a regular basis, they need some data to work with, right? Now, really, really motivated students. Like when I was at university, I did this for myself, right? Did I get all of the Krebs cycle right? Did I get all of glycolysis right? But obviously, if you're teaching an 11-year-old or a 15-year-old, they're not going to probably do that. You're going to need to guide them through this process for them. You're going to need to help collect some information and give it back to them in a format they can understand, right? You've got this on this score for the next time you did this test or whatever, right? If you do little like benchmark tests at various points through the year or something, they can be small and relatively low stakes, okay? But you then can compare them and say, oh, well done, you're doing well. But here's the bits you're doing well in, okay? The more specific that information is, the better. If it's just like, oh, you got 30% in a test 6 months ago, you got 50% 2 months ago, and you've got 70% today, that doesn't give them a lot of information about where that change has come from. Yeah. But if you say, oh, you got 30% on the test on, I don't know, electrolysis 6 months ago, we've done a different test on electrolysis today, you've got 60%, that makes more sense. Electrolysis has got better, especially if you can identify other areas where they haven't yet got better, so that they can decide for themselves, that's what I need to focus on. Yeah. Let them kind of do a bit of this for you. And don't let the parents say, oh, but you're getting the student to decide what they're doing. Well, yeah, that's true, because you're training them to be good at learning. Third point, we've already covered this bit. Make time for them to review their own work. Okay. Even if it takes half an hour to answer one question, even if it takes a whole lesson to answer one question, right? Even if the lesson's an hour or an hour and a half, doesn't matter. As long as you achieve the objective, they can review their own work and they know how to identify if it's right or wrong. That's really, really important. And for some tasks like essays and things like this, like more extended complex tasks, this is going to need a lot of guidance. They're going to need a lot of help because they'll automatically read their own work and think it's great, right? Students that reread their own work, they always think they've got great marks until you literally have to show them how is it going to be perceived by an examiner. You almost have to question it with them so that they get used to how that task is going to be assessed. Okay. The last one I've got here is modeling it in a subject-specific and age-appropriate way. So you need to kind of prompt them to do what you want them to do in their head in future. So if you want them to actively think about, am I picking the right equation? You need to literally stop them and say, are you picking the right equation? And let them justify it to you, even if they have picked the right one. And this is where it gets harder because people think, oh, they've got it right, so don't worry about asking. But no, asking them if they've got it right, even if they have got it right, is kind of the point. That is the metacognition, because that means that then next time when they pick an equation, they'll ask themselves. Now, okay, I'm simplifying it. You have to do this consistently for it to start becoming an embedded habit. But people aren't going to have this embedded habit of questioning themselves if you don't put it in the first place, if you don't embed this in the first place in your lessons. So one of the easiest pieces one of the easiest hints to take away from this session is always ask students to almost question them as to, are you sure you're right? Even if they are right, they'll very soon realize that you asked this question regardless, and they'll realize they need to justify it. And if they can't justify it, don't move on until they can. Yeah. And it's also the thing that most tutors and teachers don't do. Yeah. Most tutors and teachers, as soon as they get the right answer, they like breathe a sigh of relief and go, off, you can move on. Yeah. And that's also what students expect. So they'll soon come to realize you're a different breed of tutor when you don't do that. Okay, have we got questions of any of this so far? It's either really clear or makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, seems to be clear to most people, I hope. Helen.
Sorry, that was just meaning yes, really clear. Thank you. Brilliant, love it. Yeah.
No, amazing. Thank you very much. So hopefully you're going to go away from this and you're going to force your students to question what they're doing, even when they're getting it right. Okay, so they can justify themselves. Maybe you'll be as cruel and mean as me and tell them to find your deliberate mistake when you don't make one. Leave them happily searching for it all day long, and give them success criteria on a regular basis. Mark your own work before I mark it. Don't give them too many hints. So easy to give the students too many hints before, and to mark too much before, or to tell them it's the right or wrong answer too quickly. I still do it, even though I now teach metacognition. I still do it sometimes. I'm like, damn it, I shouldn't have said that was right. I should have waited for them to have answered it themselves. But that's fine. That's just, we all work on our own practice. So hopefully there's some real practical things you can go away and do tomorrow, or today, if you've got lessons today, I suppose, that can actually help develop metacognition. But remember, it's a consistency thing. You're not just going to do this once and then suddenly they've ticked the box. They're like, metacognition is unlocked, and they suddenly become some superhuman. Nothing in the real world works like that. Okay, only in Hollywood movies, and they're generally a load of rubbish anyway. So remember, you're going to need to keep pushing this. You're going to need to do it repeatedly for several times, but eventually you will start reaping the rewards. Students that have really got the ability to check their own work, find out where they're wrong, question whether they're right or wrong, and correct the course by themselves. That leaves you to be able to focus on other things. Okay, I think that is, we're ahead of schedule. We have 10 minutes left. The next session is on priming and motivation. I'm going to be ambitious in telling you I can help to turn even your most resistant students to really enjoy what you're teaching them within a couple of weeks. Now, that is ambitious, I know, because there are some children that really don't like whatever you're teaching them, and this is a real challenge. So if you want to learn a bit more about priming and motivation, please join us on Wednesday, the 7th of August, 11 o'clock. But otherwise, are there any other questions on the content for today's session? Is that a question, Amy?
Yeah, it's kind of partly a question, but partly a comment or discussion.
Great.
Really. But, I work a lot with people with neurodivergence, and I'm actually not a tutor. We offer tutoring as part of the package, but I buy that in. But I do a lot of work with supporting the clients and their families kind of surrounding the tutoring. And I think this is a really good approach that you can kind of filter into other areas as well, because we do a lot of, with my clients, I do a lot of things like mapping. So if they're sort of not knowing where to start, we start with a blank piece of paper and kind of break it down. And it's kind of like the same principle with what you were saying about knowing what they do know as well as what they don't know, and then how to direct it, because it's kind of almost, with neurodivergent clients, they're often kind of like, it's just the sea of the unknown and they don't know where to start. So it's really good to focus in on what they do know and what, you know, to kind of like make it clearer. So I think it will kind of be really useful in the approach of what we're offering from the tuition side, but also in the sort of support that goes with it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the important thing with this is a lot of these practices have a disproportionately high level of effect on neurodivergent students. Neurodivergent students often stand to gain the most from these kinds of things, because if they have a deficit somewhere already, it really helps them to address the deficit. So there are some kids that are not really neurodivergent and just muddle through and coast along, and they do okay without worrying too much about any of this stuff. But really, the students where this makes the most difference are the ones that are struggling for whatever reason. It might be that there's some diagnosed need. It might be there's not a diagnosed need, but there's clearly a problem or a deficit somewhere. And it might just be the deficit was they had a terrible teacher for 2 years in primary school and they're just behind. That can be the deficit, right? The deficit can just be prior knowledge. It still looks the same. It still looks as though they're underachieving. So, or it could be that they actually have dyslexia, they actually have dyscalculia, they actually have some other complex issue. So I would just say these methods are things that work for everyone, but they work especially well for people that have got a deficit, because it might be that they help unlock the limiting factor, the thing that's holding them back. It can also be useful to help identify students that are demotivated rather than unable.
Yeah, because it can help with the sort of engagement side, can't it? Because if they feel more confident, they feel more sort of like in control of it, then they're going to engage much better than if they're just anxious about the whole thing.
Yeah, and you tend to find especially that, well, I've found in my experience, when I've ever been teaching or had other people teaching neurodivergent students, they are often much more prone to guess because they're not really sure. They don't really understand how the process works for some reason. So the more they are prone to just trying to guess the answer and not put any metacognitive effort in, the more they need you to go back and rectify that. Because what you tend to find is that really, really good students, by whatever reason, accident or design, are doing this already. Most really good students are already doing some level of metacognition, because it's almost imperative to be able to unlock the top grades. You can actively go through and review, because you can't have a tutor with you every single time you're doing your work, right? You certainly don't have a tutor in your real exam, right? So it's really, really important. I think it's massively, even though the evidence says it is important, I think it's actually underreported or understated how crucial this is. I don't think there are any students coming out and getting a 9 in any subject that haven't used metacognition to some significant degree. And it's not necessarily just a niche thing with a fancy sciencey name. It's actually a description of a much broader phenomenon that happens to a greater or lesser extent for a lot of students. And we want it to happen to a greater extent for more of those students. Ade, you have a question as well.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for your session. It's really informative. My question is, as a classroom teacher and as a tutor, I'm just reflecting on my own practice and thinking about, to what extent would you suggest that we embed metacognition as part of our practice? Because I know I do it, and I probably lean to embedding it for like complex process when I'm teaching scientific concepts, but maybe not so much the basic stuff that I expect them to have learned in previous years. So I'm just thinking, to what extent would you suggest that we embed it for it to become something the students have mastered?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good point, because it's all very well and good that people like me come along and say, oh, you should embed this into your lesson and don't worry if it takes half an hour. But you're the actual one that sits there saying, well, that's half an hour. I've got to cover the entire curriculum. I've got to cover X, Y, and Z. I've got to cover all this stuff. And there's a classic issue that people come along with some sort of suggestion or some sort of training and say, oh, do this. It will really work. It's really beneficial for all these reasons. Maybe it is. But also, you have to bear in mind what you're already doing, at least in some places, is going to be really beneficial anyway. So you can't just chuck out things you're already doing to try and do more metacognition necessarily. So you almost have to be metacognitive yourself to think, okay, well, where does it fit? And where am I already doing really well, where actually the best thing to do is to not spend time on this, spend time on this in other places, but actually I just need to get through a lot of things here. Everyone go away, and how are you going to maximize the use of the time you have? One thing I would say is, instilling in students, it's almost essential in my experience to instill in students an expectation they will work outside of your lessons if they want to achieve, whether it's classroom lessons or tutorial lessons. Instill in them, if you want to truly be successful, doesn't matter whether you're currently the top in the class or the bottom in the class or anywhere in between. If you want to be successful, the fastest way to be successful is to make progress in the lessons and outside. If you're only expecting that you're going to work inside a tutorial lesson, you're going to fall behind, because how far you could progress if you were working now and then also going away and being able to direct yourself to do more progress, to do more practice, that is what's most valuable, because then they can use these metacognitive skills for themselves and make more progress when they're not actually having any contact time. Now, obviously, with students having so many competing demands on their time. They might be doing gymnastics. They've got their friends they want to see. They're on TikTok or something. I don't know what the hell they're doing on there, but they're doing all these other things in their life. Okay, saying, oh, please spend another hour doing metacognition and or doing maths questions and being really, really metacognitive. It's a hard, high effort thing to do, right? But don't shy away from encouraging your students to do hard work. Never ever give up and say, well, the student doesn't want to do hard work, so I won't ask them. No, still insist they do hard work. And then if they just do not as much as you expect, they're still doing hard work, right? So that's what I would say. But in terms of how much of your practice can you realistically integrate this, it's a professional decision for you to make that I can't possibly make better than you. And that is where people that are in a training position, I think they always need to understand that actually there's an extent to which I can give you knowledge and understanding of a certain ideas and principles. At the end of the day, you need to make the decision as to how best this integrates into your practice. Now, I hope this doesn't apply to people where they say, oh, it shouldn't integrate into my practice. It's not as good as anything I'm doing at the minute. Hopefully it's still useful to everybody. But if you say, look, I can put it in here, but I don't have time to put it in for this bit, that's your professional decision to make. And if you've got good reasons for that, they're good reasons. Okay. Any other questions before we close the session today? Nope. Brilliant. Well, look, you've been a lovely crowd. I'm really, really glad to see a couple of repeat faces who've come back to most of the mini series. I suppose I should give some sort of medal or award to the people that complete the whole mini series, I think, to support you and recognize your commitment. But I hope you found it all very helpful. And if for those of you that want to come and learn about priming and motivation, we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, the 7th of August at 11 o'clock. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.